Hello, and welcome to Commendable Commotion. Today it's a quick interview with the writer Nick Bryant, who's just published a very interesting book titled The Truth About Watergate, A Tale of Extraordinary Lies and Liars. I recently read this book and I was eager to spread the word about it a little, so you're going to hear a bit about what's in his book. And of course, if you want to find out the rest, you're going to have to buy it and read it. It's a very interesting book, and Nick's published some brilliant works over the years. He's, of course, the man who published Jeffrey Epstein's contact book several years ago on the internet. So without further ado, listen to this to get a taste of what The Truth About Watergate has to offer, and afterwards, make sure you buy the book. Here we go. So your Watergate book, The Truth About Watergate, finished reading it. I liked it. But the thing about, the Watergate thing, like people of my generation, some of them aren't really familiar with Watergate. It's just such a sprawling, complicated story. So I'm just wondering, did you find it kind of hard to get your head around when you started writing this?
Watergate is very, very complex.
Yeah.
And it is a conspiracy within a conspiracy. And there have been really good books written about Watergate, but they've been tomes and they've been convoluted. And what I wanted to do was to render Watergate as simplistically as possible. But I have read all those tomes. And what got me interested in Watergate, at the heart of Watergate, there's a CIA sexual blackmail operation, which has been covered up all these years. It's kind of amazing. But so I found out about that. And when I was working on the Franklin Scanlon Confessions of a DC Madam, and then I had heard some things about Bob Woodward. He's the famed journalist that him and Bernstein that brought down Nixon. So I kind of realized that Bob Woodward was not his cover story. And then there was this brothel, so that was covered up. And I just started digging. I started reading books about Watergate. And just about every sentence in my book has a citation. It's the scholarship was very meticulous with the book. But it's only 171 pages, the narrative, which these other books are generally around 500 pages, and they're very convoluted. And but the cover story with Watergate is that 5 burglars broke into the Watergate, and they got busted, and the journalists from the Washington Post, Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein, cracked open the case and showed the malignancy and turpitude of the Nixon administration. And Nixon tried to cover it up, and therefore he was going to get impeached. And then he resigned. Nixon's been the only president to resign.
Yeah.
Now the real Watergate story is much more complex. The real Watergate story is about the military and the CIA hawks wanting Nixon out of office. Nixon was in the dominion of the hawks, and he was a rabid anti-communist. There were the anti-communist witch hunts by Joe McCarthy.
Yeah.
And Nixon was part of that. And that's how he made his name, going after a communist named Elger Hiss, who the government and the media thought was innocent. But Nixon eventually did prove that the guy was an agent. So Nixon lost. He ran against JFK in 1960, and he lost that race. And JFK was hammering him in their debates about the administration not doing anything. The Nixon administration not doing it, or the Eisenhower administration, of which Clinton was, or Nixon was the vice president, not doing anything to expunge the commies, the Red Menace from Cuba. Now, there was a plan to do that, but it was top secret. And Nixon felt for sure that the CIA had given that information to Kennedy because Nixon couldn't talk about it because it was top secret. So 8 years later, Nixon, well, he ran for the governorship of California in 62, and then he got his ass kicked. And then he just retired from politics. He gave a very venomous goodbye speech. You're not going to have Nixon to kick around anymore, he said to the press. And then he became a big shot lawyer in New York City. But well, he had this kind of awakening when he was in the wilderness, as they call it, that the U.S. with the commies had been the goal, the objective had been containment. That's why we got into Vietnam. There was, in North Vietnam had become communist, and we didn't want South Vietnam to become communist. And then we thought Laos will become communist, Cambodia will become communist, Thailand will become communist. That's what these jingos thought about the Red Menace. But Nixon realized that this wasn't working, that containment was not working. And the United States and Russia were spending astronomical amounts of money on nuclear weapons. And we reached a point where we could blow up the world many times over between the Russians and the Americans. And how insane is that? That's very insane. So Nixon had this epiphanous insight into how the world should be. And he ran for president in 1968 and he won. And he kept talking about being the peacemaker, that he was going to be the peacemaker, and everybody thought it was just a cynical Nixon campaign ploy because he'd always been a hawk. And it was thought that he's just saying this stuff to get elected, which, I mean, most politicians make promises and never keep them. I mean, that's just the nature of politics.
Yeah.
So he got into office, and on his first or second day, he issued National Security Memorandum 2, which sounds kind of like an innocuous bureaucratic directive. But what that document did was say that the CIA, the Department of Defense, and the State Department will have absolutely no bearing on his geopolitical moves. So basically, he was telling the CIA, and he was starting to negotiate with the communists. Basically, what he was telling the CIA and the Pentagon and the State Department was, go to hell. Because he knew that those three entities were run by hawks. He had been in the dominion of the hawks. He knew what they were about, and he knew that he couldn't trust them because he really did want to pull off reduction of nuclear weapons. So what he did is he started negotiating with the Russians, and then he also started negotiating with the Chinese. And the Chinese were, he wanted to, we didn't even have the United States didn't even have diplomatic relations with the Chinese. And he wanted to open up China, rapprochement it's called, for diplomatic relations. But he also, there was a real politic element to it because he wanted to use the Chinese to play against the Russians. And he felt that that would make the Russians more desirous of really sincere talks about limiting nuclear weapons. So he had a big plan, but the hawks were appalled, and they did not trust the Russians, and they did not trust the Chinese. They just didn't trust them. And Nixon actually said that he would be willing to relinquish Vietnam if the Russians started strategic arm limitation talks. And that was complete heresy to our military Our military was stunned. I mean, Nixon bombed the hell out of North Vietnam before we left. I mean, causing God knows how many casualties. But we left, and so he started this progress, these talks with the Russians and with the Chinese, and the hawks in our government said, "Well, this is bad," and Nixon was doing it all clandestinely. So the Joint Chiefs of Staff, which is in the United States, it's like the top military brass. They started an espionage ring against Nixon. His own Joint Chiefs of Staff started an espionage ring against him. That's how desperate they were, and that's how much they were willing to put on the line because of Nixon's clandestine negotiations. And it was called the Moore-Radford affair. Thomas Moore was head of the Joint Chiefs of Staff. He was an admiral, and Radford was a liaison between the Pentagon and the National Security Council. And Nixon was using the National Security Council to forge peace with the Chinese and also with the Vietnamese and also with the Russians. So Radford was stealing all kinds of top secret documents and giving them to the Joint Chiefs of Staff. And they had an inside man at the Joint Chiefs of Staff, Alexander Haig. And Alexander Haig was a shapeshifter. He was just a nasty piece of work, but a real sociopath. He could endear people. He was ostensibly under Kissinger, but he would use he would play off Kissinger with Nixon and play off Nixon with Kissinger. I mean, he really knew how to ingratiate himself. And ultimately, the Nixon administration outed the spy network that was gathering intelligence on the Nixon administration. And so then it was the CIA's turn.
And that's where your book kind of, in some ways, begins.
Yeah, I do talk about the Moore-Radford affair. I think that's really important because it shows how desperate the military was to concoct an espionage ring against the president of the United States, who they're ostensibly serving.
And so oh, sorry, yeah, go ahead.
Go ahead.
Oh yeah, no, I was just wondering so the official Watergate narrative your book posits, for those unfamiliar, sort of goes much deeper and darker than what the kind of, what we've seen in All the President's Men or what we've read, if you prefer the book rather than the movie, that kind of thing. What you're saying is that it's, a lot more, shall we say, even seedier, as it were.
All the President's Men is a work of fiction. I mean, it is a work of fiction. I mean, I'll get into it later, but Bob Woodward and Carl Bernstein were pathological liars. It's kind of interesting. I couldn't determine whether they were serial liars or pathological liars. And then I Googled serial liars, and then pathological liars came up. So now I'm just going to have to go with pathological liars with Woodward and Bernstein. I mean, they lie when they don't even need to lie. So there was a defense, a guy within the defense, his name was Daniel Ellsberg, the military, and he released the Pentagon Papers, which showed, it belied the government propaganda. It showed that the United States was getting its ass kicked in Vietnam. And the government propaganda had said that we were winning the hearts and minds of the Vietnamese. And then there was another leak. The North Vietnamese, Cambodia is adjacent to Vietnam. And the Vietnamese were using Cambodia as a launching point for attacks on South Vietnam. So the United States started bombing Cambodia. And since Cambodia was neutral, we shouldn't have been bombing Cambodia. And actually, we helped facilitate the emergence of the Khmer Rouge, which is very unfortunate. And then the last leak that really upset Nixon, I mean, this one really pissed him off, was the United States was, and with Watergate, you've got to use the word ostensible quite a bit.
Yeah.
The United States was ostensibly allies with India, and India and Pakistan were engaged in a very vicious war. But the Pakistani dictator, who was a major nasty piece of work, was buddies with the Chinese. So Nixon was buddying up to Pakistan to facilitate his communication with the Chinese. And Jack Anderson, it was leaked. And I believe that it was Admiral Moore that leaked it. We don't really know, but I think it was Admiral Moore. And Jack Anderson, who was a syndicated columnist, actually, he wrote an article about it, and he won a Pulitzer Prize for it that year. So the Nixon administration formed the plumbers, and the raison d'etre of the plumbers was to stop leaks. And then at this point, you see some heavy duty CIA infiltration. Howard Hunt becomes part of the plumbers. And these guys are weaseling themselves in any way that they possibly can into the Nixon administration. They want to know what's going on in the Nixon administration. And I think that the daily double for them, or the lotto, would be getting Nixon out of office. But they're just infiltrating them. And then James McCord, who is another big-time CIA agent, he infiltrated the committee to reelect the president, which was part of the Nixon administration, but he also became a plumber. So you've got two CIA guys that have penetrated the plumbers, Howard Hunt and James McCord. And Gordon Liddy is ostensibly the head of the plumbers, well, at least as far as operations go. But Hunt and McCord were super spooks. I mean, these guys were legends.
He was also a novelist, wasn't he?
What's that? Yeah, he did write some novels. And what happened there was Hunt ostensibly retired from the CIA, and he wrote novels. And it was the CIA and Hunt had this big falling out. Ostensibly had this big falling out. So Hunt was writing these novels, and he was kind of mirroring certain things that were going on politically. And the CIA was hoping that the Russians would interpret these novels as what they were doing, even though they were not doing it. It was misdirection. So that was the first time that Hunt retired, and then he retired again, and then he retired a third time when he penetrated the Nixon administration, but he wasn't retired. I mean, these CIA guys, they wanted to take Nixon down. That they really wanted to do that, but they wanted to find out what he was doing. I mean, so the plumbers, Liddy and Hunt, go to Los Angeles. I said earlier that Daniel Ellsberg had leaked the Pentagon Papers, which was voluminous, and it showed that the Americans were getting our asses kicked in Vietnam. So they broke into Daniel Ellsberg's psychiatrist's office, and well, first of all, it was Hunt and Liddy that cased it, but then they brought some Cubans. And they had a Polaroid camera, and they were going to shoot everything and then put everything back pristinely after they'd case the place. But they ended up breaking windows and overturning cabinets. They said that they wanted to make it look like drug addicts had hit the psychiatrist's apartment. So. And the CIA knew all about that because Hunt was part of it. And he was telling the CIA all this stuff. So, and then there's G. Gordon Liddy, and John Dean is, and this is, he gets kind of convoluted. John Dean is the counsel to the president.
Yeah.
And he's an apparatchik, and he wants power. This is a guy that's lusting for power. And and the Nixon administration is coming up with various, because there were all these anti-war protests going on, and they actually thought that the communists might be aiding and abetting these. So there were a number of directives that were going to spy on the war protesters, and actually the CIA and FBI did, but there were some things that were battered around in the Nixon administration that were really bad, but they never made it up to Nixon. And the one that was pretty bad was actually his Attorney General, John Mitchell, put the kibosh on it. But anyway, so Dean says to Liddy, we're going to give you $1 million. Come up with a first-rate intelligence plan. And Liddy thinks that it's John Mitchell, who is the Attorney General, who's ordering Dean to say that. So him and Hunt come up with these crazy plans. And the CIA makes the charts. I mean, they're talking about kidnapping people and using prostitutes to blackmail Democrats. I mean, it's, using beating up anti-war. It was complete. Liddy was crazy. I mean, he turned out to be honorable, but he was crazy. Anybody that takes their family to go see Lenny Riefenstahl's Triumph of the Will on Friday night is, a little out there. So
yeah,
the CIA makes all these charts. The plan was called Gemstone, and the CIA. So the CIA, Hunt and Liddy have broken into Dr. Fielding's office, Daniel Ellsberg's, and the CIA knows all about that. And now they're making charts for Gemstone. So the CIA is totally keeping up on what's going on. And ultimately, what happens with the Watergate, Dean has an interest in the Watergate. And I believe that the reason why he has an interest in the Watergate is his wife was very good friends with a madame who ran a CIA blackmail operations, a brothel. And her name was Heidi Bryken. And you would, the Democratic National Committee was on the 6th floor of the Watergate building. And if you wanted if you were a Democratic big shot and you wanted a prostitute, you would go to Maxie Wells, who was a secretary at the Democratic National Committee. And she had like an album of prostitutes, and you could page through the prostitutes, and you would find the prostitute that you wanted, and then they would call over to the Columbia Plaza, which was a block away from the Watergate. And then you would have a liaison with that prostitute, but the CI would film everything. So if you went to that brothel, you were getting compromised. I mean, that's just how it went.
Yeah, the Columbia Plaza was that looked like a nice building. I saw it in the Discovery Channel documentary about Watergate. Did you use that documentary as a source as well as the books you read?
No, I just went with the books.
Right.
And I went with the books, and I went with the articles, and I went with all the government documentation.
Yeah.
I mean, that was tens of thousands of pages. So I kind of had I wasn't really, by the time I wrote the book, I had read so much stuff about Watergate that I pretty much had an idea of where I wanted to go with it, and the books that I wanted to use. Now, I was able to find information after I started writing the book that I hadn't previously known, but going into it, I pretty much had an idea of, because I studied Watergate pretty intensely, of what I wanted to do. So G. Gordon Liddy and John Dean and Jeb Magruder. He's head of the committee to reelect the president. This is where it's complex here. So you've got Jeb Magruder, who's head of the committee to reelect the president, and he's acting head because as soon as Nixon runs for his second term, John Mitchell is going to take over, and Magruder's going to be his underling. But at the time, he's head. And then you've got John Dean, who is lying to G. Gordon Liddy, saying that John Mitchell is actually sanctioning this. So they meet with John Mitchell, and G. Gordon Liddy shows John Mitchell his psychotic plans, and John Mitchell, just says, get out of my office and burn the charts, which the CIA made. And then Liddy tries a second time, and John Mitchell just says no. And then Jeb Magruder tries a third time in Florida, where he meets Mitchell in Florida, and John Mitchell says, I don't even want to talk about this anymore. Enough. But Jeb Magruder, now he's kind of a weak-willed guy, and he was actually having liaisons with prostitutes from Heidi Reagan. So there's a high probability that he was compromised. And he's supposed to be this squeaky clean kind of guy. And Liddy and Dean are putting pressure on him to deploy the burglars to go into the Watergate. Dean has been he had an interest into the Watergate. He had a couple of New York detectives that worked under him, and he had had them case the Watergate about a year earlier. So he knew, I think, about what was going down in the Watergate. So what you have is Hunt has gotten all these Cubans that were CIA assets that helped us with our ill-fated war against Cuba. And when I say war, the United States conducted a clandestine war against Cuba. I mean, the United States did some nasty things like releasing dengue fever over Cuba. I mean, there's some, the United States did some pretty awful things to Cuba once Cuba became communist. So you've got Hunt, McCord, and four Cubans who are CIA assets. And they're ordered by Liddy, by Magruder. But I think John Dean is the prime mover, and Magruder had said that John Dean was the prime mover at one point. They're ordered to go into the Watergate. Now, and to gather quote unquote intelligence on the Republican or on the Democrats. So this is where the conspiracy within a conspiracy starts. 5 guys showed up at the Watergate building and signed in at midnight. And they signed in to the 8th floor, which was the Federal Reserve, which had been burgled a month before. So you've got these 5 guys signing in at midnight to a place that had been burgled a month before. I mean, but the security guard, God bless him, he had the intelligence of an avocado. I mean, I don't know if there were like 100 working neurons there. So he didn't think anything of it. He just said, okay, and McCord thought for sure they were going to get by. I mean, McCord's goal was to get busted, but they didn't that time. They got in there and they planted one bug, and they ostensibly were to plant 2. And Dean and Magruder send them in like 3 weeks later. But this time they want dirt. Now, this is kind of interesting. And this is really where the conspiracy within a conspiracy is.
Yeah.
One of the Cubans has a key to Maxwell's desk where she keeps the album of prostitutes. And he was busted with that key, and their photography equipment was set up on her desk. So they were obviously getting that type of dirt on the Democrats. That was their goal. But that was the first conspiracy. But the second conspiracy was to get busted. The Cubans didn't know that they were part of the second conspiracy. They just thought that they were part of the first conspiracy. So when they broke in the second time, McCord had one of his lackeys call the DC police and say, there's a break-in in the Watergate. I mean, they tried to show that the security guard everything they possibly could. Like they taped doors that the security guard untaped, and then they retaped them. I mean, and the security guard still couldn't get it together to call the police. I mean, like I said, not an exceptionally bright individual. But anyway, so McCord, he had a fail-safe plan of having one of his lackeys call the police. And the cop, there were 3 cops that responded. The cop, Carl Schaffler, he was a DC undercover guy, but he was also an NSA guy too. He'd been in the NSA for a number of years. And he shouldn't have, they were parked 2 blocks away from the Watergate. Schaffler shouldn't have even been there that night. He was supposed to be in Pennsylvania. So they bust the burglars, and that was the goal, was to get busted. I mean, the goal of Magruder and Dean was to get dirt on the Democrats, but the goal of McCord and Hunt was to get busted, and they got busted.
And the rest is history.
Yes. And that's, and with Nixon, Nixon didn't like the CIA, and the CIA didn't like Nixon. And actually, the guy who ran the CIA was Dick Helms.
Yeah.
And Dick Helms and Nixon hated each other. And like, Helms should have been part of the cabinet, and he should have been part of briefing the National Security Council. He should have been an integral member. Nixon would let Helms brief the cabinet, and then he had to leave. He let Helms brief the National Security Council, then he had to leave. And then he'd say disparaging things about the CIA too. So these guys just hated each other. But the FBI, after the bust, started tracing the money back to the Committee to Re-elect the President and Jeb Magruder. And Dean got wise to this, and he called Haldeman and Ehrlichman, and he told them that John Mitchell said that we should use the CIA, because the CIA can quash domestic investigations under national security. So Dean came up with this idea, even though Magruder, or even though the Nixon's underlings thought that it was coming from John Mitchell. But none of these guys, and when this thing, when these guys got busted, like Nixon and the hierarchy of the Nixon administration had no idea what went down. They started to ferociously call each other and say, "Did you send them in?" And they would say, "No, I didn't send them in." "Did you send them in?" "No, I didn't." Who sent? So they didn't even know who sent them in. They were completely flummoxed, because Nixon was on his way to the biggest rout in presidential history up to that point in 1972 against George Montgomery. So the FBI starts an investigation, and John Dean suggests to Ehrlichman and Haldeman, who are Nixon's number one and number 2 guys, that they use the CIA. And Ehrlichman and Haldeman are sitting there with Dick Helms and the deputy assistant of the CIA. His name is General Walters. They were sitting there, and Ehrlichman and Haldeman say to Dick Helms, "We need you to stop the FBI investigation." And Helms said, "No, we're not going to." And Nixon had told Haldeman what to say if Helms didn't react and or if Helms wasn't willing. And Haldeman said this could bring up the whole Bay of Pigs thing, because he said, just tell him about the Bay of Pigs thing. So what the Bay of Pigs thing is this, the CIA was going to take over Cuba. We trained a bunch of soldiers, and it was ultimately quashed at the Bay of Pigs. Castro won. John Kennedy didn't give them air support. So that intelligence operation got pointed at John Kennedy. And Nixon knew that the CIA had been involved in the assassination of John Kennedy. And actually, there's tapes where he's got Helms in his office saying, "Who shot John? Who shot John?" grilling Helms. So as soon as Helms heard Bay of Pigs, he knew that Nixon was leveraging them, blackmailing them. And Helms immediately said, "Okay, we'll do it." But he didn't. He double-crossed Nixon. And the CIA ultimately released a bunch of very incriminating information about the break-in in Dr. Fielding's office, and also about, and then McCord came up with this letter saying that he'd been threatened, and he was afraid about talking about his, I mean, it was all CIA misdirection. And that's what started. And then the thing is, Nixon that day, he didn't even know who broke in, but his natural instinct was to cover stuff up. And he using the CIA to cover up the FBI, or to quash the FBI investigation, was obstruction of justice. So Nixon obstructed justice that day. And that's what he was impeached for, was obstructing justice. He did not know about the break-in. None of his hierarchy knew about the break-in or who ordered the break-in, but it was just his natural political instinct to cover stuff up. So that's what he did. And that's why the rest is history.
Partly rooted in Nixon's childhood, something, as you note in your book, about his lack of confrontation, which is kind of an interesting side point, but it is interesting thinking that. So I noticed at the beginning of your book you have a dramatis personae, as if the whole thing is a performance. As if the whole kind of story that most people are familiar with the Watergate scandal, is a play. It's a bit of a fabrication, and I kind of liked that, because it's a good kind of comparison. Was that a conscious decision, presumably, that maybe you were thinking when writing it, oh yeah, this is like a performance, or am I just looking too much into it in that weird
It's
way?
Watergate is very Shakespearean.
Yeah.
When you think about it, you've got some King Lear stuff going on. You've got some Macbeth stuff going on. I mean, it's some Richard III stuff going on. I mean, it's Watergate's very Shakespearean.
Yeah, and I know you've said this before, and you've noted this before in other interviews, but I mean, you can see parallels with, all sorts of historical events, and also, if you're like me and you study theater, like you can see it in performances and plays that you see today, like Hamilton. We know about obviously the blackmail situation there, and anyone who's seen the musical will be familiar with it as well. You described it very well. What happened again, for those unfamiliar with Alexander Hamilton?
Well, Alexander Hamilton was having an affair with a 23-year-old who was married, and he was getting blackmailed by her husband. And then a muckraking journalist came along, and he outed Hamilton's affair. And Hamilton and Jefferson really disliked each other. They were very antagonistic. And the muckraker thought for sure that Jefferson would give him an appointment in his administration, and Jefferson wouldn't. So then he outed Jefferson for having sex with one of his slaves, Sally Hemings, which DNA has proven that actually Jefferson did have children with Sally Hemings.
I see.
So sexual political blackmail has been going on in the United States since the founding fathers.
Yeah, it's interesting. It's just interesting, like, seeing that kind of continuity because we know what happened with Alexander Hamilton. We, I guess, seem to know what happened with the dark stuff about Watergate. But here's the thing. I mean, so you got the books, you got the tomes, as you said, very interesting books by people like Jim Hogan. You use them as a basis for your research. You get the government documents, that kind of thing, court records. Um, how did you talk to Jim Hogan, the
Yes.
author? Yeah, okay. And what was that
I talked
relationship?
to Jim Hogan quite a bit, and I talked to Len Kolodny quite a bit.
And they were helpful?
Len wrote, "Oh yeah, big time." And I was Hogan. I I was wrestling with it because it's such a monster of a
Yeah.
story. And so we were talking about McCord, and Hogan said to me, McCord had two primary objectives: to take Nixon down and to protect that brothel, that CI blackmail operation, because he was head of that CI blackmail operation. And then when he said that, it just all clicked at that point. Because it's such a big story. And what I've explained to you is maybe 3% of it. I don't know, 5% of it. So it's a huge story. But then he said, Jim Hogan said that to me, and then I clicked. His book, Secret Agendas, was published, I believe, in 1985. And it was the first Watergate revisionist book. And the investigative journalism in it is pretty breathtaking. I took a
Oh
lot.
yeah.
I used Secret Agenda a lot for certain parts of my book on Watergate.
Yeah, so very good. So I'd encourage people to get that book and read it, and I'd encourage people to also get your book and read it, The Truth About Watergate. Where can people find it?
Wherever books are sold.
Perfect, perfect. So, in terms of, before we finish up, what do you want to write about next? Anything in particular?
I've been writing about very dark stuff for a long time.
Yeah.
I think I might want to write about picnics and fishing. But I doubt that I'm constitutionally capable of that. So I'd like to write a book on Epstein.
Okay, Epstein. So,
That that would be my next book. I
yeah.
I know I know a lot about Epstein that has yet to hit the public. So I'd like to write a book about Epstein.
Yeah, you sure do. Now, the thing is, there are a lot of books about Epstein, as you mentioned. You know stuff about what happened there that you say hasn't been released to the public. Actually, that's interesting. What sort of stuff?
There's a lot of stuff in Epstein that people aren't aware of, and I'd like to make them aware of that.
And you'd have an edge over a lot of the other books on Epstein because of that
Yeah,
information.
I would suggest that your viewers go to my my podcast and watch the Alpha and Omega of the Jeffrey Epstein cover up, and that will give you a lot of information that you've never had before.
Very good, very good. And there's some interesting blog posts there as well about all sorts of other things. Quite dark, but very interesting all the same. There's some stuff about P. Diddy. There's some stuff about P. Diddy on your blog as well. Now he's.
Well, P. Diddy is the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Manhattan that covered up Epstein is launching the P. Diddy investigation. So we know the fix is in. We just don't know what the fix is at this point. His name is Andre Damian Williams Jr., and he's a very corrupt guy. And you can go to my website and watch a little documentary I made about P. Diddy. Although you have to become a Patreon, but it's only $4.
Exactly. Yeah, I'd encourage everyone to do that. So that's your website is nickbryantnyc.com. Is that the one?
That's it.
Lovely,
And
lovely.
well, I want to thank you for having me on your show, Matthew.
You're very welcome, and thank you very much indeed. Best of luck, and everyone should go check out your website, your books, and become a patron to Nick Bryant's Patreon. So thank you, and have a great afternoon.
You too. Thank you.